Good evening. Oh, you can do better than that. Come on. I heard you singing. You were screaming at the top of your lungs. I hope that song is true. Though he slay me, you will worship, right? He is enough, and God is enough. I remember when my husband's mentor, we went to visit him, and he had discipled my husband for years, and that man had the whole Bible memorized, and poured that into my husband, and we went to go visit him, and he said, my wife is gone, and all my friends are gone, but I have the Lord, and he's enough. And he is enough, isn't he? He really is enough. So I'm thankful for the opportunity to speak upon a topic on contentment, and it certainly is one that is needed in our day and age, learning to live a life of contentment. We live in a very discontent society. Thomas Watson says that if we would be content, we would never sin. And that's really true. If you haven't picked up The Art of Divine Contentment, you need to pick it up. My husband had tried for years to get me to read that book, and I kind of stuck my nose up at it, and finally picked it up, about 5 years before the Lord took him to heaven, and went through it with a couple of people, and it was life-changing for me, and I'm very thankful that I had it read when the Lord took him home, because it certainly helped me to face widowhood in a much deeper, richer way, being content in widowhood. So I hope you do pick that book up and read it. It is a good read. It will change and transform your life. In fact, anything that Thomas Watson writes is excellent. And my husband told me that. And so when he passed away, I gobbled up all the Thomas Watson books before my son and son-in-law could grab them. So I'm working my way through them, and they are rich. Modern day writers don't write like that, and gives you a lot of food for thought. Anyway, we're going to look at learning to live a life of contentment. We're going to be covering 3 sessions this weekend, plus the Q&A. We're going to look at, first of all, learning to live a life of contentment by putting off all murmuring and arguing. When you think about it, if we are content, we would stop all complaining and all arguing, because Jesus says, out of the abundance of the heart, your mouth speaks. And so if you have a contented heart, it's going to come out in your speech. It will come out by having content speech. Tomorrow morning, we're going to learn to live a life of contentment, which involves learning the 4 keys to contentment. And our brother Paul tells us that he's learned the secret to contentment, and he's going to give us 4 keys to contentment. And so you'll have to come tomorrow morning to learn what those 4 keys are that Paul is going to share with us. And I'm glad that he doesn't keep the secret to himself. He's going to tell us how we can be content. And then lastly, we're going to learn to live a life of contentment by being obedient. When you think about it, if we would be obedient to the Lord in every area of our life, we would live a life of contentment. Think about it. Disobedience leads to discontent. When you think about what Thomas Watson says, if we would never sin, we'd be content. If we commit adultery, what happens? We're discontent. If we lie, we're discontent. You see what he's saying? So if you never commit adultery, if you never lie, you never steal, we are discontent, and therefore that discontent leads to a life of disobedience. And so we're going to discover 5 commands for the new woman that, if you obey, could aid you in leading a life of contentment. But for tonight, we're going to look at the danger of murmuring and arguing, and so learning how to put that off so that we might be content. So if you would, turn in your Bibles to Philippians chapter 2, and we're just going to cover a few verses this evening. Benjamin Franklin once said this: any fool can criticize, condemn, and complain, and most fools do. Jesus Christ says through his word in Philippians 2:14 through 18, do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither labored in vain. Yes, and I, being offered as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. For the same reason, you be glad and rejoice with me. Now, you have an outline there this evening that we're going to look at. We're going to look at three basic things. First of all, the command to not murmur. We are not to murmur. Secondly, motivations to not murmur. And Paul gives 5 motivations why we should not murmur. One has to do with our leadership. One has to do with our relationship with God. And the other 3 has to do with our testimony to the lost world that we're living in. And I'll share those when we get there to those verses. And then lastly, the model of the Apostle Paul. He is in prison, and yet he's not murmuring. He's not murdering either, but he's not murmuring. Glad he's not murdering, but he's not murmuring. And we need to think about where Paul is when he is writing this epistle. He's in a Roman prison. He's chained to prison guards. It's very dark there. It stinks. There's very few toilets, if any at all, so that you can imagine the stench of the prisoners and the smell there. Very little food, very little water. And so most often the prisoners would ask for a speedy death. Many of them committed suicide. And often the male and female prisoners were incarcerated together. And so there was a lot of sexual immorality going on there in prison. And yet we see the Apostle Paul throughout this epistle, 16 times he talks about rejoice, be glad, be happy. In whatever state you are, be content. Don't be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Let your requests be made known to God. And he talks about the things that have really that we as women really need to lay hold of, because ladies, we're not only discontent and murmuring and complaining, but we're anxious about a lot of things, aren't we? And so if you struggle with worry or depression or discontent, I would encourage you to memorize the epistle to the Philippians. It will change your life. And put yourself in the shoes of the Apostle Paul. I don't know about you, but it would be a little bit challenging to be content in a Roman prison, right, with those kinds of conditions. And so, yet Paul leaves a legacy for us in how to be content. So let's look first of all at the command to not murmur. Paul says, do all things without murmuring or complaining, or your translation might say disputing. Now, ladies, the order of the Greek words here is very important because it places an emphasis on everything that we as a Christian woman does. In fact, the present tense of the verb do suggests that this command is to be done continually. And the word all means everything. We are to do everything without complaining and arguing. In fact, the word complaining means to grumble. In fact, it's a word which reflects a bad attitude along with using a low tone of voice. It's like complaining under your breath. And you've all done that, right? And those of you that say no, you're lying. So my husband often on Tuesday morning when I'm trying to get out the door to get to church to teach the ladies' Bible study, hey, honey, would you mind dropping my shirts at the dry cleaners on your way to church? And I'm reminding him, doesn't he know that I don't have time for that? You know, it's a murmuring under your breath. Or Debbie and I, when we don't do this, but I sometimes want to, I go look at Southwest and your flight's delayed, and I want to go again, you know, my flight is delayed again. Or your husband calls you and says he's going to be late for dinner, and under your breath you say, again, he's going to be late again? It's a low tone of voice. I remember when my children were growing up, there was a book that I would read to them, and they wanted me to read it every night before they went to bed. And I was like, I've read that book a zillion times. I don't want to read it another time. And so it's kind of a murmuring under your breath. That's what complaining is, a murmuring under your breath. This word is also used, the first mentioning is Acts 6:1. In those days when the number of the disciples was multiplying, there was a murmuring among the Hebrews. Why? Because the widows were neglected in the daily ministration. I think it's interesting, the first example we have of murmuring has to do with money. Nothing new under the sun, right? Peter also uses this word, murmuring, in his epistle when he says, and ladies, we would do well to take heed to what he says, we're to be hospitable without murmuring, without complaining. Debbie and I are staying in someone's home, and I don't know when they go to bed at night if they're murmuring about us being there, but hopefully not. Hopefully you're not. But you know what it's like, especially if you entertain a lot or you have people in your home. It's a temptation, what? To murmur about the time it takes to prepare the food or to get the rooms cleaned up or when they leave to clean up their mess. But we are to be hospitable without complaining, without murmuring. Ladies, we should open our homes for others, and we should do it with an attitude of joy. Thank God that you have a home that you can open up and have people in it. That's one of the things that I really miss since my husband's in glory. We used to have people over in our home all the time for dinner, and so I miss having that open home and people in my home. Also, this word, interesting, in Jude 16, this word murmuring is used to describe the speech of false teachers. Listen to this, Jude 16. They're grumblers, complainers, walking according to their own lust, and their mouth speaking great, swelling words, flattering words. Why? So they can gain advantage of people. And I don't know about you, I don't want the speech of a false teacher. They're grumblers, they're complainers. Now, it's interesting, when Paul is writing this epistle to the church at Philippi, and he says, do everything without murmuring and complaining, most of the ones that are sitting there in the synagogue listening to this circular letter be read would probably have a story come into their mind that they would be familiar with, because most Jewish boys had the first 5 books of Moses memorized by the time they were 12 years old. And so their thoughts would go back to who? The Israelites, remember in Exodus? Remember how many times they murmured and complained? They murmured about the food. They murmured about Moses' wife. They murmur. And so they more than likely would have this story in mind. And I don't want you to turn back to Exodus, but I want you to turn back to 1 Corinthians 10, where Paul kind of rehearses what happened there. And ladies, there is a warning for us here, just as there was for the Israelites in Exodus. Look over at 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. All were baptized to Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate that same spiritual food. All drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they lusted. And do not become idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them tempted and were destroyed by the serpents. Here's verse 10, notice. Nor complain, there's that Greek word, murmur, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples and were written for admonition, on whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him that stand take heed lest he fall. There's no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. God is faithful, and he will with the temptation make a way of escape so you can bear it. Therefore, my beloved, flee idolatry. I speak as to wise men, judge what I say. What's he saying here? Paul tells the church at Corinth, the Israelites had all these privileges. All passed through the Red Sea. Not one of them drowned in the Red Sea. They all ate that same spiritual food. They drank of that rock which was Christ, and Christ wasn't enough for them. They murmured, they complained, and they lusted after things that were not theirs. And Paul says God was not well pleased with them, and he destroyed many of them. Ladies, we too have so many advantages. Do you realize the advantage that you have to live in a country where you can freely worship, sing like you sang a while ago, have a Bible on your lap? I mean, there are places around the world that would love the opportunity. 96,000 people were martyred for their faith. I think it was a couple of years ago around the world. We have so many advantages. But for many of us in this room, Christ is not enough. He's not enough. And so we murmur and complain about what we don't have, and we lust for things that are not ours. And God is not pleased. And you notice Paul said there's a way of escape. There's a way of escape. There's no temptation taken us, but such as common to all of us, right? And God has made a way of escape. The problem is, most of us don't want to take the escape route. You know what the escape route is? To be content, right? We'll talk about that in the morning. If we were content with every situation, every person in our life, everything that happens to us, we would not murmur. We would not complain. Well, Paul mentions another form of speech we do well to put off. Disputing means arguing. In fact, it reflects a legal connotation of disputing, and it might refer to going to court to settle a difference. This describes a person who's always disagreeing with others. Have you ever met someone like that? Have you ever met someone that likes to disagree just to disagree? Those people are hard to be around, aren't they? They just always want to disagree. No wonder they're never content. No wonder they're never joyful. No wonder they have no peace. I have some of them, they email me. It seems like they just like to constantly harass me. You know, they want to just argue about nothing. Warren Wiersbe once said this: murmuring Christians are seldom of any use in the cause of Christ. If only God's children would stop their whisperings about this one or that one, about this policy or that policy. Beware of the grumbling undertone. Do not join the devil's crowd by engaging your energies in stirring up strife. End of quote. Ladies, we're to do everything without disputing, arguing. And I want to say very kindly and graciously to you as an older woman, you will be accountable on Judgment Day, even for those things you post on social media. And in my humble opinion, we as Christians are really failing on social media by arguing and complaining and saying things we would never say to someone's face. But we'll say it on our Instagram account, we'll say it on Facebook, and we think on Judgment Day we're going to get a King's X for that, and we're not. We're going to be accountable for everything we've done in our body, whether it's good or whether it's bad. And so if you're going to use your Instagram account, your Facebook, and all the other social media out there, use it for the glory of God. And remember, He knows what you're writing. He knows what you're doing. And there will be an accounting for that day. We don't want to be known as women that are divisive and always stirring up trouble, right? We want to be very careful with that. In fact, it's not by chance. You know, we jumped right into the middle of chapter 2. But it's not by chance that Paul begins chapter 2, if you look at the words. Therefore, if there's any consolation in Christ, any comfort of love, any fellowship of the Spirit, fulfill my joy. Here's what you want to fulfill a pastor's joy. Be like-minded. Have the same love. Be of one accord, one mind. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each one of you esteem everyone better than yourself. Ladies, if you were really looking at the person next to you, in front of you, behind you, if you were looking at that woman better than yourself, you would not murmur about her. You wouldn't argue with her, right? If we really lived that out, arguing and complaining would not be a problem in our life. So if someone starts arguing with you, like Paul says, do everything without arguing, then you don't argue back. You don't join it. I often tell women that I counsel, if they have a husband that's difficult to live with and they start harassing them or arguing, I say, just be quiet or walk in another room. We're to put off, according to what Paul says in Ephesians, put off all clamoring. We're not to argue with each other. We're not to bicker with each other. So, ladies, I want to emphasize that 3-letter word that Paul uses here. He says, do everything, all things. All things without complaining and arguing. So this means you get out of bed in the morning. When you get my age, it's a little bit challenging. With no murmuring. Just be thankful you can put your feet on the ground, right? Teach your children to go to bed without murmuring. When you tell them it's time for bed, teach them to go to bed without murmuring, without complaining. It means you go to that restaurant you may not want to go to without complaining. My husband and I, we go out to eat sometimes. He'd go, where do you want to go? I go, I don't care. Where do you want to go? I don't care. And then he'll pick a restaurant. I go, I don't want to go there. He said, you just said you didn't care where you wanted to go. You know? So I was kind of murmuring under my breath, I'll go anywhere, but I don't want to go there, you know? It means you go to your in-laws without complaining. That's challenging. I had two, that my husband's parents were not believers and they were alcoholics. It was very challenging. But it means you go to your in-laws without murmuring. It means you cook meals, clean your house, run errands, grocery shop, everything without murmuring. John MacArthur has a word for us here I think it's worth listening to. He says, now if you're in Hiroshima and it's 1945, you have a problem worthy of considerable concern. But just because you lost out on a promotion or a business deal, just because your child announced last week she hates her room, just because the bank notified you this morning that you're overdrawn, I'm sure you can find a way to survive and calm down, review the situation and think it through. I hear all about midlife crisis. Do you know there are nations in the world that don't even have midlife crisis because they don't live that long? Some people aren't bothered by such things at all. There are parts of the world where the average lifespan is 37 years, and men and women are spared the distressing reality of a 40th birthday. Some people complain about grocery bills. More than 10,000 people die of starvation every day, and you're complaining about grocery bills? Millions more suffer from malnutrition. Some people say they complain about the high cost of rent. Well, maybe you'd rather be a pavement dweller in Calcutta. They don't pay rent. They're born, they live, and they die on the pavement. The only thing they have to worry about is to find a rag they can put under their head when they go to sleep at night. You see, while these kind of horrors go on around the world in a sort of a normal accepted pace, we throw temper tantrums because we get seated at a poorly located table in a fancy restaurant. Or we're frustrated because we can't lose 10 pounds. Or we gripe about our monthly debts. You've got problems relative to what? But you see, it's the mood of the mob to complain. And then the idealistic, fantasy-oriented, consumptive culture feeds the sin of discontent. How can we be discontent? Remember Lamentations 3:39? Why should any mortal being or anyone offer complaint in view of his sins? What do we have to complain about? Puts it in perspective, doesn't it? And remember where Paul's writing this from prison. Do everything without murmuring and complaining. Ladies, this is a command by God. And John, our brother, says this is how we know him if we keep his, what? Commandments. He that says, yes, I know him, but doesn't keep his commandments is what? A liar. And the truth is not in him. So you might be saying, okay, Susan, I'm convinced I shouldn't murmur, I shouldn't complain, I shouldn't argue, but give me some motivations for not doing this. Okay, Paul will. And there are 5 motivations for not murmuring and arguing. And as I said, 3 have to do with our testimony towards the lost world. 1 has to do with our relationship with God. And the last one has to do with leadership, our leadership. Notice what Paul writes in verse 15. Why should I not murmur? So that I will be blameless and harmless, a child of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Ladies, the first motivation for not murmuring is so that you might be blameless. What's he saying? Your testimony is at stake. People are watching you. The word blameless means someone who cannot be caught and accused. You're above reproach, without fault. Our second motivation for not complaining, if you're taking notes, is to be harmless. Harmless. This word means without any mix of deceit. Someone who is sincere, unadulterated. In fact, this describes the inward condition of your soul. This is what God sees. The inward condition of your soul. Blameless seems to denote the outward condition that the world sees. The inward is what God sees. In fact, the word harmless is a word that was used of wine which had not been diluted and of metal which had not been weakened in any way. In fact, Jesus gave this command to the disciples when he sent them out. He said, remember, be blameless, be harmless as a dove if you're going to minister. Ladies, we must be blameless. We must be harmless. If we're not, you know what happens? We send a confusing message to the world. Why would the world want to be a Christian if they see you out and about and they know you're supposed to be a believer and they see you arguing with your husband, they see you bickering at your child, they see your mouth just full of discontent. Can you believe this? Can you believe that? Can you believe that? You know, on and on it goes. Why would you want to be a Christian? Why would that be attractive to a lost world? We just look like the world, right? We look like the world. And ladies, the only way we can do this, the only way we can practice contentment in our speech is to have a relationship with the Lord that is pure, that is holy, keeping short accounts with God and others. Guard your heart and feed your soul with the pure milk of God's Word. Well, the third motivation for not arguing, notice what Paul says, is so we can show the world that we are children of God without fault. Now, we didn't have time to get into the introduction of this book, but Paul believes these are saints. He knows they're Christians. And what he's saying is, I'm not doubting that you're a believer, but he's saying, show the world that you are a child of God without fault. Show them that Christianity is real. Show them that it's genuine. Ladies, we have enough people today that are a mockery when it comes to Christianity. It's almost weekly now that we hear of somebody who once professed Christ. They write books, they speak, and all of a sudden they're gone. They've denied the faith. They've fallen morally. They have fallen spiritually. And so we have enough people that are making a mockery of Christianity. I was telling the ladies this morning when I was teaching on discipleship that I had a woman one time and she said, if that woman's going to go to heaven, I'd rather go to hell than spend eternity with her. Ladies, we don't want to make a mockery of Christianity. We want to show the world that we are children of light. Jesus says in Matthew 17:17, "O faithless and perverse generation, how long will I be with you? How long will I bear with you?" And he's talking about this crooked and perverse nation that we live in. That's what Paul's saying. Ladies, we live in a wicked, perverse. You talk about perverse. Our culture is perverse. It is perverted. We have become Romans 1. We are living in a culture that has a reprobate mind. They're fools. They don't even know right from wrong anymore. It's a crazy world. And yet we are to show the world that we are children of God without fault. Paul is very clear here of our biblical responsibility. Number 4, the fourth reason for no murmuring, no arguing. Notice what he says. We are to shine as lights in the world. Shine as lights in the world. The word shine here means to appear. And the lights here refer to the heavenly bodies, the sun and the moon and the stars. Ladies, we're to shine as lights in a very dark world. And it's, I don't know if you've ever been in a really dark place. Several years ago when our kids were growing up, we took them to the Merrimack Caverns in Missouri. Have you anybody ever been to any dark caves or anything? Okay, well, you know what I'm talking about. So they take you in there, on a little cart or something, and they go in there, and then they turn out all the lights. And if you've ever been, it is downright creepy. And it's a little bit scary. It's pretty scary to be in it reminds me of the false teachers that Jude talks about. They're going to be in the blackness of darkness forever. I can't imagine what that's going to be like for them, but what a horrific eternity in blackness of darkness that they will be spending. Anyway, they take you in those caves, they turn all the lights out, and it just feels thick. It's really scary. And then when they turn on a light, it's like, oh, thank you. It's comforting. Sometimes Debbie and I get home late at night, and And tomorrow night we get in at midnight, Lord willing. So by the time we get home, it'll be about 1. And, so I walk in my back door, and that's kind of creepy at first till I turn the light on, right? It's pitch dark. But there's something very comforting about light that dispels the darkness. That is what Paul is saying. Ladies, shine as a light in this very dark world. How are you going to do that? Stop murmuring. Stop complaining. Stop arguing. Use your speech to the glory of God. Our words, which are argumentative and complaining, are not comforting to a lost world, but rather it's repelling to them. I wonder how much more effective we could be in sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ if our speech was joyful, happy, engaging. My husband used to call it winsome. Be winsome with your speech. How much more inviting would the lost world want to come and to ask us about the hope that is within us, right? I remember one time I failed here, but I was putting gas in my car, and I went in to go pay the bill. For some reason, the credit card wouldn't take at the pump, and I walked in there and I was paying my bill, and the guy said, "Hey, you seem very happy. What's the key?" And I missed the opportunity, much to my shame, to tell him what the key was, because I thought, I got to get home and fix Doug's dinner. Like Doug would really be upset if I was 10 minutes late because I was sharing the gospel with what's the key to my happiness. But just even little things like that, that means a lot to a lost world. And we see so much complaining, so much arguing, so much anger in our culture. And ladies, we need to shine as lights in this very, very dark world that we live in. Well, Paul says in verse 16, he says, we're to hold fast the word of life. Hold fast means we hold it firmly. Word of life is the gospel, which is a word which has life in itself. In fact, it was used in secular Greek of offering wine to a guest at a banquet. What's Paul saying? You Philippian believers, hold out the gospel of Jesus Christ. Ladies, what good would it do if we held out a cup and said, hey, would you like this cup of murmuring? This is what I'm going to offer you. Isn't this grand and glorious? No. Paul says, hold forth the gospel, that cup of wine, the good news of Jesus Christ to the lost world. So ladies, we move on to the fifth motivation for not complaining. Notice what Paul says. He says, so that I can rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. What is the fifth motivation for not murmuring, not complaining? So that your leadership will rejoice in the day of Christ. Ladies, have you ever stopped and considered that when your life is pleasing to the Lord, especially in the area of your speech, that your pastor, your elders rejoice knowing that you're living out the gospel, that you're actually listening to their sermons on Sunday and then living it out? I know that used to be the joy of my husband's heart, to see men and women that would actually listen to his sermons and then go out and do the work, right? They weren't just hearers of the word, they were doers of the word. Your leadership rejoices when you obey what they are teaching. And that's what Paul's saying. I will rejoice in the day of Christ that I haven't labored in vain. Paul's saying, I'm looking forward to that day when I stand before Christ and I'm going to give an account to the Lord, to the chief shepherd for the church at Philippi. And I want to stand before the Lord on that day and give a good account for you, that you were people who did not murmur, that you did not complain and argue. Paul warns of this in another passage, and ladies, we would do well to take heed of this. Obey them that have the rule over you and submit to them. Why? For they watch for your souls, that they're going to give an account. Let them do that with joy and not with grief. That will be unprofitable for you. In other words, on that day, Peter talks about it in 1 Peter 5, the shepherds are going to appear before the chief shepherd, and they're going to have to give an account for those that they've shepherded. And Paul's saying, I want to do that with joy, not with grief. So stop your arguing, stop your complaining, because I have to give an account for you on that day. And Paul goes on to say, I want to know then that I haven't run in vain. I haven't labored in vain. And notice that he's running, not walking. Ladies, the Christian life is a race. We are running. And he says, I want to know on that day that I have not run or labored in vain. He loved the church at Philippi. This was a church that was dear to his heart. We know the church at Galatia, the church at Corinth. He talks about, I think I've labored in vain for you guys, especially the church at Galatia. They were going back to Judaism. And he said, I feel like I've run in vain for you. I've labored in vain. I've toiled to the point of exhaustion. And you guys are going back to Judaism. He didn't want the church at Philippi to be like that. I want to know on that day that I did not run or labor in vain. So we turn from the 5 motivations to not murmur and complain to now the model of the Apostle Paul in not murmuring. Notice what he says. Yes, and if I'm being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I'm happy. I rejoice. For the same reason, you be happy and rejoice with me. Paul's desire to be able to rejoice that he had not labored in vain for the Philippians is followed by a statement about his joy in the midst of suffering. And ladies, he knew the reality that he might be beheaded by Nero was real. He was waiting trial. Very possibly that he was going to be killed. And what is he doing? He's not complaining. He's not complaining at all. He says, if I'm poured out as a drink offering, I'm glad. I rejoice. I'll be happy about this. Now, what's he talking about here when he says a drink offering? Well, when a sacrifice was offered, such as a burnt offering, an animal that they would bring in, usually one of the last things they would do, they would pour oil or wine over the offering, and it symbolized a complete devotion to God. That's what Paul's saying. If my whole life is poured out for you, I'm happy. I rejoice. I'm willing to yield my life. It is an act of worship for you. In fact, when Paul is telling the elders at Ephesus goodbye in Acts chapter 20, he says to them, he says, none of these things move me, neither count I my life dear to myself. Why? So that I can finish my course with joy. I don't count my life dear to myself. And ladies, neither should we, right? Paul says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, present your bodies, what? A living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God. That's your reasonable service, right? We're to be living sacrifices too. In fact, Paul says in his second letter to Timothy, he says, if I'm already being poured out as a drink offering and the time of my departure is at hand, I'm leaving. I fought a good fight. I finished the course. I kept the faith. In fact, when my husband passed away and I had to go give them what I wanted on his headstone, which he had happened to say about 6 months before the Lord took him, he said, hey, when I pass, I want on my headstone, he taught his people to fear the Lord. So I remembered that and I wrote it down. I was thankful for that. But anyway, I went to go do it and they said, well, it'd be better too if you could go ahead and write what you want on your headstone. And I was like, that's really creepy. And but this is something that I had wanted for years was I fought a good fight. I've fought a good fight. I finished the course. I've kept the faith. But I told the ladies in my church, if I apostatize, go scratch it off. So if you go visit my husband's grave, that's what you'll see, Doug and Susan Heck, and that's what's there. But I have always been so moved by Paul's words, and that's, I want to finish well. I want to finish well. And he says, I fought a good fight. I finished the course. I've kept the faith. But ladies, his life was one of being poured out as a drink offering. It didn't matter to him. If he was poured out to the point of death, he says, I'm glad. I rejoice. Ladies, Paul's attitude was one of rejoicing in the midst of difficult circumstances, which is a far cry from complaining and arguing. He wasn't complaining. He wasn't arguing. In fact, he goes on in verse 18 to let them know. He says, I want you to have this same joy. Be glad with me. Don't be unhappy about this. Rejoice with me about this. Ladies, it's a wonderful thing to be able to rejoice with others, and it's a wonderful cure for murmuring. I remember after my husband passed away, and one of the ladies who mentors me, she's 90 now, and she's lost 2 husbands, and one Sunday I was having a challenging time and was having a hard time keeping my emotions under control. And the next day we had lunch, and Carolyn said, Susan, you've got to stop thinking about what you've lost. And you've got to start thinking about what you have. And you know, that was a turning point for me in my widowhood, because I thought she's right. I've got to stop thinking about what I've lost and I need to start thinking about what I have. It's a wonderful cure for murmuring and complaining. And so every day since that Monday that she told me that, every day in my prayer journal, I write down at least 4 things every day that I'm thankful for, because it's changed my attitude. And ladies, it's a wonderful cure for murmuring, complaining. Thanksgiving is a wonderful cure for that. Instead of murmuring and complaining about things, Paul chooses to joy and rejoice in all things. And ladies, just a reminder, the Apostle Paul practiced what he preached. We do not see him murmuring in his circumstances. And as I mentioned, Roman imprisonment was not a fun ordeal, and we'll talk about that more tomorrow. So what is the command to not murmur? Don't do it. Are you known for murmuring speech or merry speech? The motivations not to murmur were to be blameless, were to be harmless, were to show the world that we're children of God without fault, we're to shine as lights in the world. Remember, we're to let our light so shine before men that they may see our good works, right? And glorify our Father who's in heaven. And number 5, so that our leadership will rejoice in the day of Christ. Does your speech reflect complaining or contentment? Will your leadership rejoice over you in the day when he gives an account for you? Ladies, murmuring and arguing is a dreadful, ugly sin. And it's one that I'm afraid we are all guilty of. We're all guilty of it. In fact, today, probably every one of you in this room has complained about something, right? And if not, you're lying. So we can change the topic to lying tomorrow, Tiffany. What is the opposite of complaining? It's being thankful, right? Being thankful, praising God. You know, there's a song that I used to sing, not me personally, but in my dad's church when we were growing up, "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing." Do you know how that song was born? John and Charles Wesley were on their way home to England by ship after trying to evangelize Indians in America. And they'd been very discouraged. The evangelism didn't go well, but they were on this ship with a group of Christians that really had a lot of vitality. In fact, they had more joy on that ship coming home and more spiritual encouragement than they did when they were trying to evangelize the Indians in America. And "Oh, for 1,000 Tongues" was written by Charles Wesley 11 years later after that experience on the ship, when he was encouraged by these brothers in Christ. And it was actually inspired by one of the spiritual leaders who was on this ship, who expressed his joy to Charles Wesley in this way. He said, "Oh, Brother Wesley, the Lord has done so much for my life. Had I 1,000 tongues, I would praise Jesus Christ with every one of them." Does that describe you? If you had 1,000 tongues, would you want to praise Jesus Christ with every one of them? If not, I want to give you some closing thoughts in how to change your murmuring and arguing into words of thanksgiving. And I actually pulled this from my mother's file over 15 years ago when she passed away. I am thankful, and she didn't write it, by the way. I am thankful for the taxes I pay because it means I'm employed. I am thankful for the clothes that fit a little too snug because it means I have enough to eat. I am thankful for a lawn that needs mowing, windows that need cleaning, and gutters that need fixing because it means I have a home. I am thankful for the spot I find at the far end of the parking lot because it means I'm capable of walking. I am thankful for my huge heating bill because it means I am warm. I am thankful for all the complaining I hear about our government because it means we have freedom of speech. I am thankful for the lady behind me in church who sings off key because it means I can hear. I'm thankful for the piles of laundry and ironing because it means my loved ones are nearby. I'm thankful for the alarm that goes off in the early morning hours because it means I'm alive. I'm thankful for the weariness and the aching muscles at the end of the day because it means I've been productive. I'm thankful for that person or circumstance in my life that seems overwhelming right now because it means God is at work in my life. Ladies, may our Lord Jesus help us as women to be content, to stop arguing, stop complaining, and instead turn the murmuring and complaining to thoughts of thanksgiving and contentment. May the Lord help us. Our Father in heaven, we confess before you that often we do not shine as lights in this dark world. Father, often we look just like the world. We complain about so many things. We complain about our food. We complain about our health. We complain about our weight. We complain about our clothes. We complain about our husbands. We complain about our children. And Lord, some of us have gotten in the terrible habit, sinful habit of arguing with our husbands, arguing with our children, arguing with our friends. And Lord, I pray that you would help us to realize this is not just a problem with our speech, it's a problem with our heart. Because out of the abundance of our heart, our mouth speaks. So, Father, I pray for these ladies, including myself, that as we look this weekend at the importance of learning to live a life of contentment, that we would look first of all in our hearts first, making sure that we are content where it really matters, in the inward part of our heart, our soul. Father, may we truly echo that we do have you and you are enough. You are enough. You are our contentment. You are our joy. So, Lord, I just pray that you will help us this weekend. I pray for these ladies. Pray for rest for them this evening. I pray for a good start tomorrow, Lord, as we learn the 4 keys on how to be content. Lord, I look forward to that time together tomorrow with these precious ladies. I pray these things in Christ's name, my Savior. Amen.